Hello and welcome to Avasant's Digital Forum, Computer Economics, the Recovery of IT Spending in 2021. My name is Andriana Albert and I will be your MC today. As a thank you to everyone who is joining us today, you will receive a complimentary copy of the executive summary to our Computer Economics, IT Spending and Staffing Benchmarks 2021-2022. As we aim to make these sessions as interactive as possible, we encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A features on your dashboard to pose questions to the panelists. They will be answering them live throughout the hour. Also, a replay of Avasant's digital forum will be emailed to all attendees shortly. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. Frank Scavo is a partner and president of research at Avasant. Dave Wagner is senior research director at Avasant. Dave and Frank are also the primary authors of the study we will be discussing today, IT Spending and Staffing Benchmarks. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks very much, Andriana. As she mentioned, I'm Frank Scavo, along here with Dave Wagner, and she acknowledged us as the primary authors of this study, our IT Spending and Staffing Benchmarks. But I just wanted to say it's actually a team effort. We have a substantial team that prepares this. It takes about 6 months. We do an industry survey, and some of our survey respondents are on this call. Thank you very much to those that are listening in. This is a study that we've been doing at Computer Economics since 1990. And last year, as many of you know, Computer Economics was acquired by Avasant. We are now an integral part of Avasant Research. And we continue to conduct this study every year. And these metrics are very popular. They're used by IT organizations to benchmark their IT spending and staffing levels. They're also used by most of the major consulting firms and accounting firms around the world. So some good data here. I enjoy this. I know Dave enjoys this as well. When we get the survey responses back and we get our metrics, like Dave said the other day, it's kind of like a kid in a candy store. We kind of like, we're seeing what, you know, how the real state of the industry in terms of IT spending. And we just enjoy looking at the trends. And this year, there's some very interesting changes in the metrics. The trends have been highly influenced by what's been going on in the global economy and, of course, the global pandemic. So we're going to go over those, and Dave is going to walk us through, and I'll be commenting as we go forward as well. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Dave.
hey, thanks, Frank. Thanks, Andriana. Very nice to be talking to everybody today. Frank says it's like a kid in a candy store. I always think of it like Christmas. I get to open the data like a present. Get to find out every year what I got. Andriana, could you go to the next slide, please? And excuse me, I'm going to start with the good news. Last year we did this webinar, and you know, it was right in the middle of a pandemic, and we had to spend a lot of the time qualifying everything and talking about how things are in the middle of a lot of change, and things are still in the middle of a lot of change. Let's face it. But you know, let's start with the good news, and we'll talk about the rest in a minute. The good news is we're seeing 75% of companies are planning to increase their IT operational spending. This is the highest we've ever seen. This is the broadest, the largest number of companies planning on increasing their IT spending, at least in the cloud era, the last decade. We have data going back to 1990. I didn't check, to be perfectly honest, all the way back to 1990, but it's the farthest back I could find. We're seeing planned increases of 3%, which is, you know, modest but strong. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. And we're only seeing 16% of companies planning to decrease their IT spending. That again, that's a low since the last recession. So it's a very strong and very broad recovery from last year. And Andrea, the next slide, please. I'll show a little more color into this, and then, you know, Frank, I'll get your opinion. But one of the things we should point out here is you'll see this 3% is right in line, horizontally, right across the board through 2017. There ought to be a big red bar or a line or something in that 2020 year, obviously. That 3% is based on surveys that took place from January to April. March was a little bit of a surprise, as we all know. But what's important here to really take into account is that 3% is really in line with the strong economic times before the pandemic. The pre-pandemic increases and the post-pandemic increases are very similar. It's important to keep in mind as we talk here, because some things have changed and we're going to talk about. But prior to the pandemic, most companies were really successful with these budget increases of about 3%. It was above inflation. We were seeing inflation around 1% and 2%. And they were getting cost savings from going to the cloud, SaaS, automation, other reasons they were getting rid of their workloads. So they were saving money and reinvesting that in the business. We didn't need to see big increases to meet growth. Economic growth didn't require hiring, didn't require major capital investments. So we're seeing increases in line with the previous thinking, though the thinking might be changing. Frank, we're going to talk a lot more about this in a minute, but basically, what are you feeling about these budget increases and what we're seeing so far?
Well, you made an interesting point about this time last year in March, and I'll tell you, it doesn't seem like it's been a year since we gave this same.
And it's also feels like 100 years.
I mean, it's like, under this pandemic, I mean, we're like in a time warp or something. I mean, it seems like we were just talking about the 2020 data, and now we're on 2021. But I would point out, Dave, that this is not the only survey we do relative to the outlook for IT spending, and we do our kind of our fourth quarter survey as well. And we talked then, and I believe we also gave another digital forum then about that. And we talked a lot about the K-shaped recovery. Remember that? And we saw basically about half the organizations were showing increase in IT spending and half were showing actually a decline. So it was like the haves and the have-nots. Now, as you pointed out here on that previous slide, we don't need to go back to it, but we see that it's a much more broader, that K-shaped is turned into that top bar of the K is a lot bigger now than the bottom bar. So, I mean, a year ago when we gave this digital forum, I don't think any of us expected to see this. I mean, we expected this was going to lead to a major economic recession, and it's been very difficult to forecast exactly what's going to happen here. So we're very pleased to see that IT spending has bounced back. It's a very broad, trend of growth. I recall back in the late 90s, there was probably larger increases, but a lot of that had to do with Y2K. But like you said, since the beginning of the cloud era, I don't think I've ever seen these statistics this strong. So, it's like, looking at this chart here, it's like the pandemic never happened. There was a severe, economic decline, and we see it in the broader economic measures as well. Employment, GDP growth has bounced back very strongly. I think the latest numbers out of, the U.S. government show that it was only a 2-quarter recession. The recession was officially over, earlier this year. I'm not sure exactly which quarter they called it over, but there's been a very strong bounce back, and we're seeing that in IT spending. And like we've shown here in that little expectation reality, it looks on this chart like it's a straight line. Well, in reality, we've been all over to get where we are today.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and you're right. If you look at the GDP chart, I believe it's the first quarter of this year was through the roof, like 20% growth. And the reason why is because there was 2 quarters before that where we lost 20%
Right.
of the GDP.
Right. Let me, before you go on to the next slide, let me point out, one other thing I want to mention this is, so we have our surveys where we collect this data from a large number of respondents. And then at Avasant, we also have our consulting and our advisory business. And what we're seeing here really tracks with what we see on the advisory side. Last March and April, we saw a lot of our consulting projects strategic sourcing and so on, put on hold. Client said, yeah, we still want to do it, but, we got other fish to fry right now. We got to put this off. And around August, September, I mean, we saw those projects plus others come roaring back. And, we were so, pleased that the business was bouncing back like that, and we got into hiring mode. So, what we're seeing here in the statistics from our surveys matches what we're also seeing in our consulting and advisory practice.
Absolutely. Andrea, would you mind going to the next slide, please?
We also have a few good questions on this topic.
Oh, hey, yeah, let's go ahead. We want this to be interactive. So go ahead and give us some questions.
Sure. First one, do you see IT OpEx cost savings as a top of mind priority for leaders?
Actually, that is a question we're going to be addressing as we go along. But I'll tell you, just to spoiler alert, I think the opposite is actually true. I think right now companies are really concentrating on top line growth rather than worrying about their savings. The digital economy is changing. The post-COVID economy is different. And companies right now are reaching out to transform their business and make it work for that post-COVID economy, the growth that we hope we see coming, and not actually worrying so much about those bottom line numbers. Frank, would you agree?
I just about took the words out of my mouth. You would think in an economic recession, companies would be going into cost cutting mode and looking for ways to optimize IT spending. And, frankly, we're just not seeing that. We're seeing more emphasis, like Dave said, on growing the top line and taking advantage of opportunities that, ironically, the pandemic has given us. So, no.
Yeah. Well, and to further that, Frank, you talked about we take surveys throughout the whole year. We took special coronavirus surveys all through last year to track potential IT budget cuts. And one of the things that we routinely saw was that the budget cuts were as small as companies could afford. There weren't nearly as many as we expected. And the reason was that everybody perceived IT as a strategic way out of what was happening. They had to meet their customers in new places. They had to rebuild their business plan from scratch to make it work. And so right now is not the time to worry about cutting costs. I mean, let me back that up. If you're a company that has to cut costs, you have to. I mean, that's just the reality. But if you can afford to, you need to think of IT as a strategic source right now and looking at growing.
That's good. Adriana, was there another question or?
There is indeed. Why would 2020 not be an outlier to have higher IT spend, much over 3%, considering many companies had to use more of their IT infrastructure for remote work, and on top of that, series of cyber attacks?
Yeah, good question. The survey, although we did take special surveys to try to account for the coronavirus. So our survey period is January to April. We went back to the folks that took the survey in January and February and gave them a special survey asking them if they were changing their plans because of COVID. At that point, when the survey came out, most people were holding steady, trying to figure out what was going to happen. So one of the reasons why we put a caveat on that number is that we know a lot of what happened after we went to press. So we have further studies that we can pull out that you can find on avasantresearch.com to talk about what happened in that second half of the year. But a lot of it is that. The other is that, what we saw, Frank mentioned, was the haves and have-nots of COVID, right? There were companies that had the cash reserves that could afford to spend on IT, who did. And they spent more money on getting work from home and digital transformation projects. There were other companies that were forced to freeze their budgets, whether they wanted to or not. It was just the reality. They didn't have the cash. So those are the two parts to that. Frank, am I missing anything?
Yeah, the thing I would point in, they say, well, the 3% doesn't seem like much if you got to implement all this work from home and so on. But remember, that's a total IT budget. And a lot of what went on was there was reallocation of that budget to the urgent requirements of supporting work from home, cybersecurity, and so on. So, I mean, and we, we asked for, free form comments in our surveys, and we saw this coming back in some of the comments. So an organization might have a big SAP implementation or upgrade planned for 2020, and they said, you know what, put that on hold right now. Let's push that off until next year. Right now, we've got to, buy a bunch of laptops and VPNs and bolster our cybersecurity. So that 3%, is just being reallocated was just being reallocated. And some of that is now what we're seeing kind of roaring back in 2021 is those projects that were put on hold because of needing to pay attention to, say, work from home are now coming back, and the spending is being redirected that way. So I think that's part of it.
Yep. And another thing to remember about that too is, depending on your sector, personnel is 40 to 50% of your budget. Your applications and your data center make it up to 70 or 80%. Those end user devices, security, those things, they don't make up a very large percentage of the budget. So you can usually squeak in a little more there by tweaking elsewhere in the budget around the edges. Great. Well, I'm sure we'll have more questions as we go. But we just want to show the growth by organization size chart here. Very important. Typically, when we see this chart in a given year, there's a sector or two that's an outlier. Typically, you'll see small companies of all sectors tend to be the canary in the coal mine. They tend to respond the most to economic fluctuations. Excuse me. So the fact that the small organizations are growing almost in line with their larger brethren there means that this recovery feels pretty strong, pretty broad, even for smaller companies that tend to need to worry more about cash, right? So it begs the question, we got the Fonz there, happy days here again. And that's the really important thing to wonder about. And Andriana, if you'll flip slides, we'll answer the question. Yes, I think so. But don't expect it to be smooth, right? I mean, we just saw on 2 slides ago, the squiggly line. We're going to be in a squiggly line for a long time. And I'm not going to read all these bullet points at you here. That I know that's boring, but I'll give you a little story. A month ago, or a little less than a month ago, when we published this, the U.S. had just ended its mask mandates. The coronavirus was at its lowest number of cases in the country. The economy was growing, everything looked great. People were traveling again. I took a trip east to see family. In the 3 weeks or so since then, the Delta variant has come around, and so we'll talk about more of that in a moment. But what we're basically going to say here is the next 6 to 9 months are going to change week to week, every day, every minute. So, the last quarter we have numbers for the GDP rose 6.5%. Global economy is supposed to go up 5.8% this year. We're regaining our jobs. We've got vaccines coming. That 4 billion vaccines so far this year to me is an amazing number. That's like the moon landing, as far as I'm concerned. Going in less than a year from nothing to 4 billion vaccines just blows me away. A shout out to research and science all over the world, as far as I'm concerned. US is hitting a vaccination number, although later than we hoped. There are lots of treatments, therapeutics in stage 3 trials that we're hoping are going to be game changers as well. So we are expecting good things. Andriana, if you don't mind, next slide. But there's still a lot of things that can go wrong. And Frank, I'll want your opinion on these, I think, because I think this is where, our executive audience is really worried, right? You always have to worry about what can go wrong. And obviously the first way it could go wrong is variants. Talking about the Delta variant now, but on the radar, we've got the Lambda and the Phi Alpha Theta and every
It's like a fraternity or sorority here.
Yeah. And as much as we want this to go away, it's not going away, right? It's going to be here for a while. We're still going to have to adjust to it. We've got unemployment. Unemployment's persisting around 6%. Hopefully it continues to decrease, but it's been pretty stubborn to get too far below that number. But at the same time, which is a little ironic, is we have this new competition for talent, right? People are calling it the Great Quit or the Great Resignation. There are a lot of employees that are either quitting their jobs, looking for new opportunities, or folks are sitting on the sidelines waiting to get back into the economy because they don't have access to childcare. They're not getting paid well enough in their mind. They're not getting the opportunities they want. There are a lot of reasons why folks are either choosing not to participate or choosing to look for higher paying jobs. So there are these landmines, and there's one more we'll talk about separately. These landmines that are still out there, Frank. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you gave a good summary here. I think the people side of this is really quite interesting. And we have this. You mentioned this paradox. At the time we still have kind of stubbornly high unemployment. We didn't bring the chart in here, but there's also a record number of jobs available. So, like, why aren't the unemployed taking these jobs? And you and I had a discussion when we were writing the executive summary here. And I remember we went kind of round and round of this. Is this because the unemployment benefits are so generous that people are, encouraged not to go back to work? And I think that could be true, for lower paying jobs, but, generally for IT jobs, which are, frankly, more higher paying. I don't think that's really what's going on there. I think, the kind of things you indicated here about childcare and closed schools, there's just a lot of disruption in the employment market. And I think that's going to continue even after the pandemic is over, because employees and employers are getting a look at, kind of the art of the possible with the work from home. A lot of jobs that used to require us to go into the office or into data centers now, we're finding that those can be done remotely. And that means that employees can be looking for work outside of their metropolitan area. And, the converse of that is employers can be looking for employees outside of their local areas. So I saw some statistic the other day that said a very high number of employees were talking about quitting their jobs, like you said, the big quit. And I don't think this is going to end, as soon as the lockdowns are over and we're back to normal. I think that, this accelerated a trend we were already seeing.
Yeah. Well, Frank, I'm thinking about quitting, just so you know.
Don't you dare.
In fact, I'm going to quit right in the middle of the webinar.
Don't scare me.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think I don't want to get overly political about this, but I think some of it has to do with the wages we're offering, across the, not just in IT, but across the economic spectrum. And so I think we're going to see a change in compensation, which brings us to the next slide.
Right. Yeah, good.
So the next slide. So we're going to highlight this separately. I don't want to make a big point out of this. I know it's funny. I'm making a whole slide and then I'm saying I don't want to make a big point. But we can get overly economic and overly in the weeds about this, and I don't want to do that. But inflation is a major concern, I think, for these budgets. What's really different in the 2021 budget increase of 3% and the budget increases in previous years of 3% is that the costs that companies are going to see this year may exceed that the costs of inflation are going to exceed that 3%. So what we're seeing right now is inflation that's currently over 4%. Now, a lot of that is what they call transitory inflation, meaning that it's going to go away. It's part of COVID. It's part of restocking the supply chain, rejiggering everything. And that's true, probably. I don't really care particularly about the inflation itself. But what we do know is that capital equipment is in short supply right now, servers, PCs, et cetera, because of supply chain disruptions. And that means they cost more. And we just talked about IT staff is going to cost more. So what is really interesting about these 3% increases is what seems like a normal, positive 3% increase, a good, strong, may turn out to be inadequate by the end of the year. And that's something to really think about as you plan for the year. Don't worry necessarily about the economic foundation behind it, but think about the reality that you may find you can't do all that you were hoping to do. And then there's more to this story, but I actually want to stop there and talk about that part with you, Frank, before we talk about the second half here. Are you worried about the inflation? Like, am I overblowing this?
I don't think you're overblowing this, and yes, I am. I am worried about it. I'm hoping it's transitory. I'm hoping that it's largely a result of, what do they call it? Not bounce back, but things that prices are accelerating in areas where there are shortages. So the example in IT is, we know right now there are supply chain shortages because of the chip shortage, which has to do with so many customers canceling orders for new equipment that the chip manufacturers cut back their production, and they can't just ramp that back up. So now that there's this strong bounce back, which we saw earlier, that results in lower supply, higher demand, which means prices increase. So hopefully that will work its way through the economy, and we won't see this level of inflation increase. On the other hand, unlike many on this call, I'm old enough to have lived through the 70s when when inflation was reaching double digits. And that was a time that was not fun. We had high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, called stagflation. It was, we had the misery index. And I remember in one of my first jobs in IT that if you didn't get a double-digit pay increase, you were out looking for another job, because you just couldn't afford to continue working when your rent was going up double digits and your food bills and so on. So we hope this is transitory, like you said here, and we're going to be watching this as we go forward. But like we've said in other contexts, those 3% IT budget increases that look good now might not look so good at the end of the year if you're looking at higher inflation rates.
Yeah, and and it's not just the chips inside the servers or the PCs. Toyota was having trouble making its cars, not because they had a shortage of steel or workers. They
Exactly.
didn't have chips that went into the computers that ran the cars.
And those are the same chip manufacturers.
Exactly.
They're just different, and you can't just switch over, right?
Exactly.
So,
exactly. Yeah. And then there's another half to this, which is, the cloud transition has reached its peak in a lot of ways, right? There are a lot of companies that are very close to 100% cloud, or very close. There are companies that have gotten most, if not all, of their applications into a SaaS format. So one of the things we're seeing too is that the low-hanging fruit that we were getting cost savings, at least on an initial level, from moving to the cloud are disappearing, right? And we're actually getting into that phase for some companies or some products where we're seeing the reality that a subscription-based service may cost more in the long run, right? You take a license out for a product, you capitalize it, you have it until it's no longer valuable. With SaaS, you're paying for it forever. And then that's okay, right? There's so many good things about the cloud and SaaS model. But one of the things that's true is that we're actually getting to the point where companies need to actually find the money to continue to pay for growth again, which they didn't have to do for a while because they were growing their capabilities without having to grow their budgets. Frank, are we seeing this now with our clients and with outside? You're talking to folks. Is this becoming more of an issue? I think it's going to be a major issue the next few years.
It is becoming more of an issue. And I was reminded, you were talking about cloud savings and so on. We had a digital forum, I think just last week, on this concept of FinOps, FINOPS, like DevOps only with financial management. And the thing with the cloud, like you said, it's not automatic cost savings. The good news about the cloud is anyone can go out there and procure more cloud infrastructure services, for example, with a credit card. The bad news is that, many people forget to turn it off when they're done. So, you need to pay attention to how you're consuming those cloud services and be sure they kind of, supply and demand match there. Otherwise, you can be overspending on cloud. And I think companies are realizing they need another level of management over that cloud spending. So yeah, a lot of the low hanging fruit has already been picked. There's going to be we see this every year, and you don't showing the statistic here, but the percentage of applications in the cloud has been steadily increasing since we've been tracking it over the last 5 or 7 years. And that's going to continue. But now, the easy stuff in many companies has been done. Now we're talking about more core systems, more fundamental transformation, and that's going to cost more money to get there.
Yeah. So you see this chart here, adequacy of current IT budgets. I didn't put historical numbers here because I didn't want to confuse folks, but this is very much in line with what we would see this chart be year to year. And I posit to folks that possibly it's about 50-50 right now that think their budget is adequate or somewhat adequate and below. I suspect by the end of the year, there are going to be more folks who think of their budget as somewhat inadequate or maybe not adequate at all. So I think that's something to really plan for as an IT leader now. Andriana, happy to go on to the next section, but I suspect this is a good time if there are any questions.
Yep, we have a good one. I don't believe the comment on cloud savings is no longer there. The cost of buying hardware is still expensive, and if you take into account replenished costs, then I think cloud is still the best option in many cases. The benefits are not quantified adequately for speed of cloud versus data center costs.
Okay, well, I absolutely agree. I'm not advocating for getting off the cloud. I still think cloud is the right way to go. It is faster. There are definitely non-quantified benefits. But what we're talking about, and particularly with SaaS, but what we're talking about here is that earlier on, when say you're putting your first application in the cloud, or your first application or your first attempt at putting workload in the cloud, the savings were pretty darn high because you're probably taking some of your most expensive, some of your oldest, some of your least good stuff and putting it there. As you move forward and you migrate more and more of your workload to the cloud, the things that you're migrating are more expensive, more complicated, and because of that, the cost savings is reduced. Is that a fair way of looking at it, Frank? I think that's really what we're getting at.
I think so, and so much of this depends on the individual organization and how well they're managing their overall IT financial management. So yeah, definitely, it's like anything. The early projects are going to be the ones that are easiest or most easily cost justified. As you move on to more difficult applications, it can be harder to realize savings. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go to the cloud, because there are strategic benefits. In fact, we have a report, from a few years ago that showed IT organizations that have, at least 50% of their systems in the cloud realized something like a 15 to 20% reduction in IT spending overall. We need to refresh that report, and we will do that. I believe it will still show that going forward. But the only point here is that you need financial management, not just technical management.
Yeah, and you need to be careful that early on, a lot of the benefits also, you were getting new you were getting access to new abilities as well, right? A lot of times you take your 15-year-old ERP and move it to the cloud. Not only are you getting the new ERP, or not only are you getting it to the cloud, you're getting the benefits of a 15 years a new generation of ERP, right? So that's changing too, because now you're moving newer applications over, or newer workloads or whatever.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
Are we seeing companies outsource the cloud cost monitoring and optimization task, or manage it in-house with internal FTE labor?
Well, let me take that. That really depends on a organization's dependency on service providers for that function. So an organization that's already outsourcing, say, a good part of their data center services with a managed services provider is probably using a good mix of cloud deployment in there as well. And in those cases, we do see the service provider taking up responsibility for the overall management of the cloud spending, taking down instances when they're not needed and so on. An organization that's more, conducts their data center operations with internal personnel is going to have to build up that financial management capability to do that. So it really depends on the overall, services, the sourcing strategy, I would say.
Yeah, and there are, one of the things we are seeing is the cloud providers themselves are starting to offer these services as well.
Exactly.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we go ahead and move on then? Let's actually talk about the spending trends themselves, what we're seeing for spending trends in 2021. So we've set the stage, actually took a little longer to set the stage than I intended. I'm sorry about that. We'll talk now about where those dollars are actually going. Next slide, please, Andriana. So there are two sort of surprises we're going to see back to back here. The first is, this is the first time in 8 years a majority of companies are increasing their capital budgets. That's a surprise to me. That hasn't happened in quite a long time. At the same time, shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because a lot of the reason for that is capital budgets are the easiest budgets to cut or freeze when the economy is bad. It's easy to put off a hardware refresh for a year, although harder in this COVID recession than it would have been in some others. We also have already talked about increased prices for the same capital equipment. So it's not too much of a surprise that capital budgets have had to go up. But it's been trending down for a long time as a percentage of IT spending in the budget, as you'll see. If we went back a few more years, you'd see IT capital budgets would be 25 or more % of IT spending, of total IT spending. It's been trending down from as much as a third a while ago. That was a real long time ago, but down to 17%. So while we're seeing a bump in capital spending, I don't think, Frank, tell me if you disagree, I don't think this is a trend towards more capital spending. I think this is a correction, as they'd say. Sorry, you're on mute, Frank.
You used the word, I forget what you do. I was going to say overhang. I think a lot of this is overhang from work from home investments, laptops, VPNs, other hardware investments that had to be made last year. And I think some of that's carrying over into this year. We know that from what the comments of our survey respondents said. So I think this is transitory. I think this is going to, once those capital equipment investments have been made to support remote work, increased cybersecurity investments and so on, I think that's going to return to the downward trend that you show there on that right-hand chart.
Out of curiosity, Frank, how low do you think that chart can go? It was a 25, 30%, in 2005, say. How low can we get that number? Are we going to get it to zero one day? Or
no, because organizations still need end user computing devices.
Sure,
so, yeah. and those are typically, even though on an individual basis you could probably expense those, like many small organizations do, generally you buy them in big, groups. So that's a capital
Sure.
investment. So it's not going to get to zero, but I would expect it to still be above 10%. Even if nearly everything is in the cloud. And there's still large organizations that will continue to be for a long time that are running legacy systems, large, financial services firms running mainframe systems and so on today. So it's going to be a long tail on this.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And I think there are always going to be a few workloads that for whatever reason are not appropriate for the cloud as well. Andrea, go ahead, please, into the next slide. And this is a good one. So last year, prior to the pandemic, organizations were planning for the first time in years more than half of the organizations were planning to increase headcount at IT staffs. That actually has not been the trend for many years. Even while the economy was strong through the pre-COVID years, fewer than half of companies would plan in a given year to increase staff. The reason for that, as we mentioned ahead of time, was the transition to cloud and SaaS, automation, general improvement in productivity meant that IT staffs did not need to grow to accommodate growth in an organization. So a company could grow 15, 20%, not need to increase its staff. Prior to the cloud era, you would generally more need to increase staff and equipment to compensate for growth. So this was, perceived as a good trend. But this is further evidence in my mind, we're seeing more hiring, that we're reaching the point where we're going to need to start hiring people to accommodate for growth again. And not only in terms of more people for growth, but also in terms of different types of folks, right? The digital transformation is going to lead to a new kind of IT staff, different staffing mix, different types of folks, and they're going to need to interact more with the organization as a whole than they used to. So I think this is a trend we're going to see continue now. I don't think this is a one-off like capital spending. Do you agree, Frank?
I do agree, and I agree with your comment about the skills mix has been shifting for many years. So as we go more to the cloud, those, if I could say, lower level IT skills, data center operations, tape librarians, and so on, those are no longer really as necessary. But the jobs that are increasing are the higher level skills that are more user facing or customer facing, business analysis, project management, application development, data analytics. And those jobs are going to be harder to fill because there's a big demand. Everybody's looking for those staff members. We mentioned our other surveys. We're going to be starting our annual IT salary survey shortly. And out of that survey, we usually get a lot of good feedback on which are the skills that are hardest to fill. And this trend has been going on for some time. Those higher level skills are more difficult to fill, definitely.
Yep, agreed. And we see that in the salary study. Salaries are holding steady or even declining a little bit for folks that touch stuff. If you actually have to hang the server or you adjust the network, et cetera, your salaries are likely to be going down. If you're more of what we call a knowledge worker, you're more likely to see salary increases. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a lot of dynamics here. This is just looking at the head count. Then you mix in the whole remote work and people looking for jobs outside of their metropolitan area, or employers looking at low-cost places to source new people. You've got all that mixed in with the salary impact, and we'll cover that when we get into our salary study.
Yeah. Next slide, please, Andriana. So this is the budget priorities for the year. And the way these numbers are done is we take the percentage of companies that are increasing in this area and subtract the percentage of companies that are decreasing in this area. So not to skip to the end or anything, but that's why you see organizations increasing spending at data centers -5%, That means there are more companies that are decreasing their budgets in the data center than increasing, which is not such a surprise, obviously, because of the move to the cloud. But let's start at the top here. Information security has been at the top of this list for as long as I've been doing this job, and it probably will be there long after I have retired. But there are changes in security, right? What's interesting is that it's not just a stagnant, yes, security is important, but what's amazing is every year we have new issues, right? So work from home this year changed the perimeter, made us have to think about how to guard things very differently. Ransomware has been around for years, but it hit a high profile moment earlier this year when the pipeline was shut down and gas prices went up. Security is always going to be new. It's always going to be changing. It's always going to be at the top. One of the things that's interesting here is if you look at this list in a given year, end user technology would be near the bottom. It is much higher up. We're seeing that because, of course, work from home and also a year where we didn't necessarily refresh our equipment. So end user technology is near the top. And as I said before, data center, we're sunsetting our data centers. We're going to need something probably still called a data center for quite a while, but we're seeing data center consolidation. We're seeing more move to the cloud. Frank, any number here stand out to you above the rest or anything you want to comment on?
Well, yeah, I was going to say this might be a good time to point out that on this information security privacy, we're coming out with new benchmarks. So we're working on them right now, Dave and I are, for cybersecurity spending. So we hope to have those out in September. That's going to be a very interesting report. We've already got the preliminary numbers. We're seeing growth, obviously, in cybersecurity, security, and compliance. And for the first time, we're going to be able to provide benchmarks to allow organizations to actually see how they stand in that area relative to their industry peers. So watch for that.
Great. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that report. That's going to be really useful. Andriana, next slide, please. So this is a chart that's done the same way. It's net percentage of increase versus decrease, but this is spending priorities by specific IT initiatives. Again, the cloud apps, cloud infrastructure, data analytics, digital transformation, they've been the top four for a long time. But I don't want to discount that because the post-COVID economy here, it's omni-channel, it's digital, it's data-driven. Those four at the top are plus data integration are what are going to drive the digital transformation, going to drive the post-COVID economy. These numbers actually have increased a little bit because of that. These priorities matter. They're strategic. They're not just basically what's going on is this is accelerating. The COVID accelerated the need to really digitize what we're doing here. So I don't want to just skip over them because they're at the top. Frank, this is likely to be the focus for years. What do you see? We're talking about the end of the low-hanging fruit with cloud apps, but we're not done yet there, right? I mean, what do you see about this? Do you see this top four staying the same, or?
I do see it staying the same. This is a long kind of secular trend toward digital transformation and creating new opportunities with applications in the cloud, next generation apps, and so on. I did want to mention some people may be looking at those bottom three and say, well, I don't know if I believe this. So let me take the one at the bottom that says automation. Dave and I were looking at this last night and realized that we actually mislabeled this bar. That should say data center automation, not just automation, because we know automation is a huge investment area that really falls, kind of under the digital transformation bar, right? So we know that there's a lot of automation investments, but this is specifically around data center automation. And the way I explain this is that there's not a big priority given to data center automation because there's not a big emphasis on data centers. We're moving away from in-house data centers. So that's, I think, why that's down. Legacy systems as well. That number used to be a higher percentage, back 10, 15 years ago when organizations were taking their, mainframe systems and trying to give them either a facelift, better integration, or even replacing them. That was a higher percentage. I think a lot of that work has been done, and organizations are not willing to go through a 3 or 4 or 5 year legacy system refresh when they need critical new applications today. So they're building around those legacy systems and implementing point solutions or cloud solutions that can be deployed more quickly, and just not putting a big emphasis on those major investments. The IT shared services, I think, is more of a statistical anomaly. We know that that is a very important priority in many large and very large organizations. Our survey here is at the composite level, so it includes small, medium, large. I think if you focus just on the large or the very large organizations, for companies that have a shared services model, global business services, you're going to see that as a higher percentage. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a all in or nothing kind of
yeah,
situation.
that's right. That's right.
I think really we say here at the bottom, and we've said it a little bit when we answered a question earlier, but I really think what we're going to see is a change in the next few years for the way we look at our cloud transition. For the first few years of the cloud transition, in a lot of ways, I feel like what we were trying to do was simply replicate what we already had, but shift it to the cloud. Maybe we were upgrading our capabilities as we went, but it really was about how can we replicate this in a cheaper and more efficient way. I really think the next few years are going to be focused on transforming the business, growing that top line, growing new ways to work with our customers, changing our business plans to be more of a digital plan. I mean, obviously, if you're in the airline industry, you still have to have real airplanes with real people. But like when you look at telehealth and virtual banking, we're getting to the point where we need less and less physical interaction. And I really think that those top spending areas in cloud and digital are really going to be looking at how can we change the way we do business. So I know we're getting close to the end, Adriana. Why don't we flip to the last slide here and wrap it up and take a couple questions.
Perfect.
So just to recap, this is the bottom line. Really, things are changing fast. Be prepared to react. The variance, the economic reality, they change on a dime right now. As I said, 3 weeks after we published this thing, the whole economic viewpoint changed a lot. But the good news is IT budgets are up. The bad news is maybe the budgets aren't up enough. For the next few years, digital transformation is king. And even though I did this really fast to get to questions, since I started reading these bullets, things have changed again. It's just true. They're just changing that fast right now. Please stay tuned to Avasant Research. We cover this all year long, not just once. So we cover the economic reality all the time and the budget reality, IT spending year round. Frank, do you have anything you want to say to wrap up?
No, I would just say this is a good year to kind of validates my personal philosophy. I don't like to make forecasts, right? I'd rather report what's going on and what the trends seem to indicate. But this year has shown that it's pretty risky to try to make a forecast about what's going to happen, because you never know in this economy, in this world situation, we never really know what's next. So let's take any more questions, Adriana.
Yep, we've got a couple on security.
Okay.
Do you see a trend where the IT security costs are not the only costs for security? Companies are looking at moving the CISO role out of CIO and the costs go to others versus just IT.
I think that's, as businesses are digitized, if the CIO role is mainly, internal support of systems, you have, take the energy industry, right? You have the whole operations infrastructure of delivering power. That is not generally under the CIO. That's a, that's critical infrastructure. So yeah, cybersecurity is a broader concept than just like data security or compliance. So definitely, this is an area where there's a larger, budgetary responsibility for security, especially cybersecurity. I think that's definitely true.
Okay, so we have another question that's related to that. Is IT resiliency, i.e. recovery, built into the security spend?
Built into the security set, SET?
Spend.
We use the TBM framework for our security cost pools, and business continuity is right at the borderline. So we have a separate line in our IT spending study that collects data on business continuity and disaster recovery. So we can report that either as part of that or separately. But it is related. I mean, obviously, if your systems go down because of a data breach, and like Colonial took down their systems because of the ransomware attack, they didn't know, what they could do. Is that business continuity or is that cybersecurity? So it's definitely related. But there are other things like if a hurricane hits or a power outage, that's not cyber, but it is business continuity. So it's at the border.
Yeah, we report them as separate numbers, just so you can see both, but you need to think of them as a related expense.
Right.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
I think so, yeah.
So this is more of a comment. In the RGT theory, I think of IT capital investments as all transformational spending. It's very important. Any comments on that?
Well, it's hard. I'm not sure what RGT means, but it's certainly difficult to say anything is not important. So capital spending is a hugely important line item or category of IT spending. Some of it is routine and some of it is definitely transformational. So I would agree with that.
Well, and a good leader, should every dollar you spend should be transformational. That said, we all know that there's some spending to keep the lights on, but you should be thinking about your lights. Do the lights give you the proper light? Is there shadow in the wrong place? Is that a good leader will reevaluate everything, in which case it's transformational. But I do think there's such a thing as basic blocking and tackling too, and that's okay.
Well, and we do actually, we have another dimension in our IT spending study: run, grow, and transform the business, right? So some IT capital spending is to run the business. Obviously, equipment refresh, a simple refresh would be in that category. Grow the business. If your business is growing, you need to add more desktops or more servers. That would be grow the business. Transform, if you're investing, say, in Internet of Things devices and new capabilities, that would be transformational. That would be capital spending that's in that third category. So that's another cut that you can take to look at your IT spending.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much. So thank you to both of you for joining us and all of our participants and your great questions. We hope you enjoyed the session as much as we did. All of today's session attendees will receive a complimentary copy of the executive summary of our 2021-2022 IT spending and staffing benchmark study, as well as a replay of the digital forum, which will be also available on our event page. We'll also send you the slides presented today. Thank you again for everyone joining, and we'll see you soon.